In this video, we're going to talk about statistical study stages, uh, which consists of 4 stages. The first stage is preparation, where we decide the purpose and the methods that we're going to be using for this specific statistical study. The next stage is collecting data. And collecting data will depend on the previous stage, where the purpose and the methods. The process, basically we're going to process our data that we collected, we're going to summarize it or perform certain statistical procedures with it. And the last stage is conclusion, where we're going to interpret our results based on the purpose and the set goal. So right now we're going to discuss, in this video, we're going to discuss preparation stage in more details. Based on the methods of statistical studies, we can identify 2 types of studies. One is observational study, where researchers simply observe characteristics of the objects and take measurements in the sample, or taking a survey, take measurements, so forth. Basically, they do not produce the data, they simply record the data that's already available. And the second type is designed experiment, where researchers impose a treatment and controls and then observe the characteristics and take measurements. So in this case, the data is produced. The data would not exist otherwise if it was not produced. Basically, that note just reiterates what we just talked about. So let's take a look at some examples. Here's the first one, and I invite you to determine whether this is observational or experimental study. Here it is. Several studies have been conducted to analyze the relationship between vasectomies and prostate cancer. One such study found 113 cases of prostate cancer among 22,000 men who had a vasectomy. This compares to a rate of 70 cases per 22,000 among men who didn't have a vasectomy. The study shows about a 60% elevated risk of prostate cancer for men who have had a vasectomy. So, is this an observational or experimental study? I will give you a couple of seconds to think about. Pause here if you have to. The answer is this is an example of an observational study because the scientists did not do anything to produce data. They simply observed people who did vasectomy versus people who did not have vasectomy. And sometimes people try to say that it's an experimental based on the fact that people who had vasectomy, it was kind of a surgery, right? But people who set up this study, they did not themselves produce those vasectomies. They simply observed what happened to people who already did vasectomies. Does it make sense? If you have any questions about it, let me know in the class. The next example, for several years, evidence had been mounting that folic acid reduces major birth defects. In one such study, the doctors enrolled 4,753 women prior to conception and divided them randomly into two groups. One group took daily multivitamins containing 0.8 milligrams of folic acid, whereas the other group received only trace elements. A drastic reduction in the rates of major birth defects occurred among the women who took folic acid, 13 per 1,000, as compared to 23 per 1,000 for those women who did not take folic acid. Observational or experimental? What do you think? Again, if you need more time, I invite you to stop the video here. And the answer to this question would be experimental, because the scientists produced the results. They actually applied, they divided people into two groups, and they treated one group with folic acid. So therefore, they produced those results. Okay, now association. Association is when the growth of one variable can be linked to the growth of the other, or decline of the other variable. So we see that there is a correlation between two variables. Now, we should be careful not to confuse the association and causation. So causation is when the change in one variable directly triggers the change in the other variable. Association does not necessarily describes the causation or proves the causation. And in order to illustrate that, I invite you to watch this video with me. This is an excerpt from Dr. Ken Berry's speech at a conference in 2019.
Now, let's talk about correlation. Does one imply the other? Does this cause this or not? Some people would say yes, I say no. So what if I told you this is the graph from 1999 to 2009 of the amount of saturated fat eaten and the incidence of heart attack? Do you see how these numbers, you see that? They're very tightly correlated, aren't they? You're like, whoa, that looks very impressive. One of those things had to cause the other. Otherwise, they wouldn't track like that. And remember, doctors are people too. So when doctors see a drug-funded study that shows this kind of thing, they're like, dang, that's pretty impressive. One must cause the other. Problem is, you can have these correlations in nature and in medicine that have nothing to do with each other whatsoever. One has nothing to do with the other. They're two random events. They just happen to coincidentally correlate. Okay? These things happen in medicine all the time as well, and I'm going to show you a few other examples. But this is absolutely true. You can plot these numbers, and Nicolas Cage is a very dangerous man if you have a home swimming pool. Per capita cheese consumption and people who die from becoming tangled in their bed sheets. True story. So if you like cheese and big butts, I don't know, you're in trouble. Divorce rate in Maine and the consumption of margarine. It's a true correlation. Nina Teicholz talks about this. So if you live in Maine, you should eat a lot of margarine if you want to keep your marriage intact. One does not cause the other, but do you see that correlation? I mean, if you were a doctor and a drug rep walked into your office and showed you this, you'd be like, All right, got it. Yeah, you're right. But these have nothing to do with each other whatsoever. You guys know that correlation does not prove causation. This is the problem with epidemiological studies, with all the nutrition studies, with all those things that look like they show causation. Because here's the problem. This is not even correlation. These are two completely random things. They're not, this doesn't even prove correlation. And that's why you gotta at least know enough about these studies to know that just because there's a pretty curve, it doesn't prove a thing. Now look at this. Age of Miss America correlates with murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects. I don't even know. I can't even imagine. I know there was one king in Europe that was killed with a hot poker, but I'm not gonna get into that. But look how tightly, I mean, that correlates so tightly, but they're completely random events. So correlation does not prove causation, but doctors' eyes work just like your eyes. And when they see those two curves tracking, they're like, wow, look at that, boom. Vegan diet's where it's at.
So correlation does not mean causation, and tobacco industry use that fact to argue their case that even though there is a correlation between the smoking habits and lung cancer, they were arguing that one does not cause another. So when two variables may be strongly associated because they're both related to another variable called a lurking variable, which is a variable previously not considered that causes changes in the two variables. So let's take a look at an example. So strong association can be observed between the average number of computers per person in the country and the country's average life expectancy. So would you say that the number of computers cause a change in the life expectancy? Of course not. Both variables are related to country's gross domestic product, or GDP. And my cat stopped by to say hi. And here's another example. A strong association can also be observed between the number of firefighters at a fire and the damage caused by the fire. So the more firefighters, the more damage. So can we conclude that the number of firefighters causes more damage? The more firefighters we have, the more damage they cause? Of course not. The damage, both variables are related to the intensity of the fires. So more firefighters mainly means that there is a greater fire and therefore a great damage. So in the next video, we're gonna talk about collecting data.